Dear friends, today we have with us Dr. Brad Tucker from ANU. He's an eminent astrophysicist and cosmologist. And we are here today to discuss the historic moon landing achieved by India last night. Dr. Tucker, thank you so much for joining us today morning.
Yeah, no worries. It's an exciting day for not just India, but I think broader space. So much of the space community has kind of been rooting for them. You want everyone to succeed. So definitely worldwide acclaim and excitement for what they did last night.
Yeah. And how important do you think this mission was? I mean, not just for India, but as you say, for the whole world, because this is the first time a country has reached the southern pole and there could be frozen water there. So, how important is this mission, even from a scientific point of view?
Yeah, because you're right. It's all about frozen water. It's all about ice. And in fact, all of this interest stems from India's first mission, Chandrayaan-1, which
Mhm.
was this orbiter that showed, hey, there is probably a lot of ice on the moon. And the idea that there's ice means that H2O can support humans, but also you can break up through electrolysis. Essentially, you put energy in and can separate hydrogen and oxygen. So now you have oxygen for breathing, but also fuel for rockets because it's essentially hydrogen and oxygen. But the key, and this is where India's mission is important, is all of this is from satellites orbiting the moon. None of it has been on the ground measuring the rocks and soil samples directly to measure exactly how much ice is it, how deep is it, the ratios, all those sorts of things that you need to know to plan future missions. And so this is a big step for everyone's goals because we saw Russia try earlier this week, but the US is planning to go there, and a number of other countries are planning to go to the South Pole. So this information will directly support their goals, landing, and mission operations.
And also, if you could let our viewers know that how difficult it is to actually land on the moon. Now, yes, several people, I mean, America, Russia, and China are the only three countries that have reached there. And as we know that the Luna 25 mission crashed, so it still remains extremely challenging to land
Yeah.
on the moon. So technically, how big an achievement this is?
Yeah, because you have a few different issues. The trying to shift the amount of energy from leaving Earth's orbit to then slowing down around the moon, slowing down enough that you touch down softly, but also allowing the systems on board to help navigate. Because if there's slightly bumpy terrain or a crater or a boulder that you're going to land on, that's going to be disastrous. And then also, you just have to have everything technically work. You can't have a single fault in the mission so that everything goes according to plan. And just think how often a car doesn't start in the morning or your computer. None of that is an option. Everything has to work perfectly. And then you add the harshness of the space environment, the temperature extremes, the lack of atmosphere and pressure, radiation, all these sorts of issues that come into play. So it is still really hard. And as you alluded to, Russia, who did this previously before, they hadn't done it in nearly 50 years, and their Luna 25 probe didn't work for essentially the same tricky reason as before India Chandrayaan 2, and that was the altitude control system. It descended too fast and it crashed into the moon because the margin of error of being exactly the right speed and height and level and slightly off is a huge difference. And that means just a very little bit slower or faster can mean disaster for your mission. So it is, again, everything working perfectly where there's no margin for error. It's hard enough on Earth, let alone on the moon.
Yeah, and another aspect of ISRO is that they try to do things in an economical manner. But, they do it within a certain budget. Like, there are lots of things on social media saying that the budget for even this rover and lander is less than, some Hollywood movies. So,
Yep.
how important is that actually going into the future as well of space exploration?
Yeah, because it's not just the cost either; it's the speed. Chandrayaan 2 cost 92 million US, and then when it didn't work, they rebuilt this one for 50 million US in 3.5 years. Russia's Luna 25 took over 11 years of development and much more money because one of the costs of space is people. People require money. We like to eat and need salaries. And so when you have lots of engineers and technical people, the longer the mission goes for, the more those costs go over. So by making it quick, adapting and then making it cost effective really shows what you can do in space. And we're seeing this across the sector. The cost of doing things in space is plummeting and getting drastically cheaper. And so you can do more, you can build it quicker, but also you need to make sure that it's built at the right level that survives. You can't go too cheap. So India has kind of, I think, shown that you can do these missions for a lot less than, say, other missions. The Apollo program in today US dollars cost 180 billion. We are talking about a huge different sum of money between what India has accomplished and what happened in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, and also I think the trajectory that they took, because there are several ways of going to the moon, and I think they made a calculation of what would be the most cost effective way, and even the time that it didn't take too
Yep.
long, but they probably, I think, took a longer route than the Luna
Yes.
25.
That's right. So they took a little bit longer to the moon, and that all saves energy. That's all because of energy and fuel needed. And when you're sending a probe, you can be a little bit longer. When they sent humans to the moon, it took 3 days, and that was because they were worried about the environmental health effects and wanted to shorten that as possible. So as you said, they found other cost-effective ways of making the entire mission safe but reliable, and also by taking a little bit longer. Once they reached the orbit of the moon, because they've been in orbit around the moon for a few weeks now, they've been able to slowly test and check every system before trying that landing. And as we saw with Luna 25, sometimes you need a little bit more checks and working before you attempt that landing. And again, even though Russia had done this previously, stuff changes and stuff goes wrong. So again, all around the mission profile and design, I think is something to be applauded.
And if we come to India-Australia space collaboration, I think there is a lot of collaboration happening there as well. I mean, we have the Square Kilometer Array project where there are lots of international countries, including India. But I believe that Australia was, I think, in some way involved with Chandrayaan 3 as well, the Deep Space Network.
That's right. So the Deep Space Network, so ESA, Europeans' dish in WA, and NASA's dish outside Canberra, were both tracking and supporting and sending data, and still are, for Chandrayaan 3. And that's part of, as you said, this international effort. But also, as you said, going forward, there's other projects. In fact, there's a number of projects between ISRO and other Indian research organizations and Australian organizations. And in fact, the Australian government is currently in the process of finalizing funding for a number of joint missions funded mostly by the Australian government, for Australia and India to do joint projects in space. I mean, I have one of them. And so, that will happen. We'll hear that outcome later this year, I think around October. So we'll actually see even more cooperation on building things in space between the two countries in the coming years.
And could you, if at all possible, for you to tell us a bit more about the India-Australia collaboration at this stage?
Yeah, so there's a few different missions that people are looking at. So, one of the things that we're looking at doing is a small space telescope to study the evolution of stars and how they blow up and die. This would be led by the Indian Institute for Astrophysics in Bangalore and us here at ANU. But there's a few other groups who are looking at potentially even lunar payloads going forward as part of this mission. So Western Australia has been looking at working with ISRO, as well as some other companies, private sector companies in India, to potentially deploy future experiments on the moon and upcoming moon missions. So, there's a lot of these things happening. Scientifically, day to day, we have joint projects that we're doing. And also ISRO, in terms of rocket launching, a lot of what India does in space, I don't think gets as much credit as it for. India and ISRO, they have been so efficient and safe and cost effective at all of their launches. It's very reliable. You know that what you get, you're going to get into space. And that's still a hard thing to do. And that's not the case with every rocket and every company. So it's a very reliable group and partner to work with, which is even better because not only are the missions quick and cost effective and scientifically interesting, but it's going to work. And that's the important part.
Yeah. And if I may ask you, because it's a slightly different topic, but the UAP UFO hearings in the U.S. Congress. I mean, if we could have one comment on that. I mean, given that that there is renewed interest in the moon, and there's a lot happening in the space sector. But what do you make of those hearings? Because they actually startled the world quite a bit.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's an interesting evolution. Our view of aliens and life in space, I think, has changed for the better. And generally, in the sense, I think people are more willing to accept the idea that maybe life is out there. 50 years ago, that wasn't the case. But as we're seeing in the kind of data being talked about of aliens or UFOs, UAPs visiting Earth, I still think it's a bit not clear what it is. In some cases, we've actually been able to figure out what these things are, and some have been party balloons or plastic bags. There's a lot of things that look weird on cameras or visually, but can have an explanation. But I think the other factor that comes into play is there will be some of these things that are real, but they're terrestrial. They are Earth-based equipment. They are military jets or planes or drones even. But, like for every good reason, defense groups don't say everything. But again, that's for very good reasons. And so I think what we're seeing here is some of those things play out. And we've seen this historically. In the 70s, when they were developing stealth fighters, the US, there was a lot of reports of UFOs and even other military people saying, hey, I saw a plane, but it didn't show up on radar. Nothing made sense. But that's because the other groups, even in defense, don't know about it until it became public knowledge. So I think we will see an evolution in this in the coming decade. But I think at the very least, the positive is a more openness discussion between the public and scientists about what we see and what we study. Because if people are gathering data about meteors or UAPs or space junk, whatever the case may be, people have phones and cameras and security cameras all the time. We can use that data for science, and having a more open relationship of sharing that data it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah. And lastly, coming back to the ISRO's Chandrayaan 3 mission, as you mentioned that, perhaps India doesn't get as much credit for its achievement as it should. So, on a concluding note, can you tell us your feelings about that?
Yeah, look, I think part of it just comes down to culture and publicity. The NASA in the US is very good about sending everything they're doing and putting that information out. India quietly just gets the job done. They're kind of similar to Australia. And I think that's why we have very good relationships, because there's a lot of stuff that happens in both of our countries where maybe it's not that we're not public about it, but maybe we don't go over the top in promotion about it because that's not the nature and culture of the two countries. And in some ways, I think that's sad because they should be cheered. And that's why I'm glad so many people were watching and talking and cheering India. And in some cases, you don't like to see Russia fail, but in that, having that example in the same week of just showing what India can achieve relative to someone who's viewed as a traditional space power just goes to show how much underestimation or underappreciation of what India is capable of they've been able to do.
Dr. Tucker, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure we are going to have many more conversations with you.
No
Thank
worries.
you so much.
Thanks.